But going back to the beginning of Jonah chapter 1, I want to start to look at some defined forms. So we're going to look at masculine singular nouns and adjectives and feminine singular nouns and adjectives with the definite article, Okay, so the first example here that we're going to look at is actually the second word, the word to the left in blue, gedolah. Now we've seen this before. Gedolah on its own is a feminine singular absolute adjective meaning big. But we don't just have gedolah here, we have hagdolah. And so it's gedolah, but you can see preceding it is the letter hey with a patach beneath it, and then a dagesh in the first consonant of the word gedolah itself. So it's got all three of the standard features of the Hebrew definite article. The prefix hey, secondly, with the vowel sign patach beneath it, and then third, the dagesh in the subsequent consonant. And again, we saw earlier, melech becomes hamelech. And so similarly, the form gedolah, sometimes written with a dagesh in the first consonant, sometimes without. I'm not going to get into the reasons why right now. But when gedolah has the definite article added to it, it becomes hagdolah. Hey, patach, dagesh. And so hagdolah is the expected feminine singular defined form of the adjective gadol. Gadol, the masculine singular, when put into the feminine, becomes gedolah. It has the kamatz hey suffix. And then when it morphs from the absolute form to the defined form, we see that a hey, a patach, and a dagesh are added at the beginning. Now you remember, however, that I told you before that there are exceptions to these rules. And so look at the first word now, ha'ir. Ir, even though it may not look like it, is a feminine singular absolute noun when it's on its own, just ir. So how do we make it a defined form? Well, we add the hey, but wait a second, hold the phone, there's no dagesh inside the ayin. So what's going on here? Well, an ayin cannot take a dagesh according to the rules of Hebrew grammar, and that's true of some other letters as well that we'll encounter later on. And because the ayin cannot double, it cannot take the dagesh, we experience something called compensatory lengthening. In other words, the short vowel represented by patach, as in hagdolah, is lengthened in order to compensate for the fact that the ayin cannot be doubled with a dagesh. That's why we call it compensatory lengthening. The short vowel, or at least the historically short vowel patach, is lengthened to a long vowel kamatz because the ayin cannot double. It cannot receive the dagesh. Now you may be a little confused at this point, saying, wait, I still don't get this idea of doubling, and I'm not really clear about short vowels and long vowels, and that's okay. It's not important that we understand these issues clearly right now. And to be transparent, some Hebrew grammar books and Hebrew courses spend a lot of time on these rules right up front, and it's great because the students get a clear explanation right off the bat on how this common phenomenon works. However, I've studied and taught Hebrew long enough to know that even when these explanations are provided, novice students do not understand these concepts clearly because they don't have the historical context to make sense of it. And so for that reason, yes, I'm going to tell you what these rules are, but I'm also going to tell you at the same time, don't worry about it right now. It's just not important. As long as you can identify that ha'ir is a defined form, meaning the city, you don't really need to understand why there's a kamatz as opposed to a patach and why we're lacking the dagesh in ayin, but we have one in the gimel of Hagdolah. Remember, the goal of this class is not to speak ancient Hebrew, it is to read and interpret ancient Hebrew. And I can tell you, with some 25 years of experience behind me that these issues just don't matter right now at this point in your learning. Will they matter eventually? Yes, absolutely, but not right now. And so for that reason, we're going to move on rather than spending too much time hyper-analyzing these subtle differences. Now, if you do want some explanations on this, please leave a comment below and I will happily provide you with some bibliography and the link to the appropriate video in which I discuss these rules. All right, going into verse 4 now, let's look for the blue forms, because the blue forms are nouns and adjectives to which the definite article will be attached. And so we see that this form is hayam, hayam. Yam is the noun, meaning see. So if we just had the word yam, it would mean see or AC. But we don't have yam, we have hayam, hayam. And we see that the noun yam is prefixed by hey and the vowel sign patach, and that there is a dagesh in the first consonant of the word yam, that is to say the yud, hayam. And that means the sea. So if you want to do a little reading just for a minute, so that we're not just analyzing words, verse 4 begins this way, Vadonai. Remember, Yud He Vav He is often said Adonai. And the Lord, because out of respect to tradition, we don't pronounce God's name. And the Lord, Hetil, he threw, he hurled, Ruach Gedolah, a great wind, feminine singular absolute forms, Ruach Gedolah, El Hayam, to the sea, or at the sea, we could say. Hayam, the sea. And if you're making sense of that phrase, even if only for the most part, congratulations, you are reading Hebrew. All right, let's look at the next form in the color blue. We have v'haoniah, v'haoniah. And so now here we have the prefix vav, which we're going to chop off, as it were. That means and. And some translations will even render the vav here as so that. We're not going to get into the nuances of this right now. That's a biblical Hebrew 2, second year issue that I don't want to deal with right now. But you can say and, or you can say so that. And then we have ha'oniah. Now we saw the form oniah above. So back in verse 3, we have the feminine singular absolute noun, oniah, a ship. How do we say the ship? Well, we're going to notice that this kamatz katan underneath the aleph is going to reduce to a shorter vowel, the chataf kamatz, because when words lengthen, vowels begin to reduce. An example of this is my first name. My full first name happens to be Christopher. Now, if you write that name out, Christopher, and I asked you to read it, you would probably pronounce it Christopher. But do you notice that when you say Christopher, you don't really fully pronounce the O? The O is reduced because the word is 3 syllables long. And when words hit 3 syllables, generally one of the vowels will reduce. Now, for those of us who live in the Connecticut area, who do our grocery shopping at Stop and Shop, if you listen to how people say that, Stop and Shop, they don't say stop and shop, even though that's the name of the store. The A vowel in and is reduced, and the D typically disappears altogether as well. And it becomes Stop and Shop. It basically becomes a 3-syllable word rather than 3 independent words, stop and shop. And when those 3 independent words are joined together, we now have a 3-syllable word, Stop and Shop, or a 3-syllable name. And as a result of its being 3 syllables, one of the vowels is going to reduce. And what happens in English happens in Hebrew. You see this in the name Abigail too, by the way. Abigail, the I vowel in Abigail, most people do not fully pronounce it. It reduces to like a half vowel. It's not pronounced as a full I vowel. Why is it? Because the name is 3 syllables long. Vowels have to reduce. So in the case of oniah, the kamatz katan, the first vowel at the beginning of the word, is reduced when we add the definite article. Notice that happening right there. You can see the cursor. And so we get V'ha'oniyah, v'ha'oniyah. Now what happens in this word? Well, we've got our feminine singular noun, and we've added the hey. But oh, wait a second, there's not a patach vowel sign beneath the hey. Why is it? Because just like ayin, aleph can't take a dagesh. And because aleph can't take the dagesh, we get compensatory lengthening in the vowel. The patach becomes kamatz. The modern pronunciation that we use today does not distinguish between a patach and a kamatz when we read Hebrew. But historically, the patach was a short vowel and the kamatz was a long vowel. When I speak Palestinian Arabic or even formal Arabic, there is a very clear distinction between long and short vowels. But with the modern pronunciation that is traditionally used for Hebrew, we just don't distinguish anymore. And that does kind of confuse things. All right, let's look at one more form for now. We get the form ha-malachim. Malachim means sailors. To make it definite, it is prefixed with a hey, a patach vowel sign, and a dagesh then goes in the first consonant of the word malachim. And there you have it. Now in the next video, we'll practice the other forms that appear in Jonah chapter 1. But for now, I just want to jump over to the Leningrad Codex and to look at a couple of these forms in the manuscript, just so that you get accustomed to reading Hebrew from the manuscript itself. All right, so here we go, the Leningrad Codex, and Jonah 1 is going to begin over here. Obadiah comes to an end right here. There's a little Masoretic note, which we'll talk about some other time, and then we come to Jonah. Now we saw in verse 2 that we had the form hagdolah. This is the feminine singular defined form, feminine singular defined. And sorry, it's a little pixelated here. I wanted to zoom in as much as I can, but it gets a little distorted, but hopefully you can see it anyway. It's easier to make out the letters. And you can see right at the beginning, we have the hey and the patach. And then if you look in the gimel just to the left, you'll see a dagesh right in the letter there. Hagdolah. That is the feminine singular defined form, which on its own would literally mean the big. All right, now in the middle of the screen, we have the phrase ha'ir hagdolah, ha'ir hagdolah. So we've already dealt with hagdolah. Now we have ha'ir, and we remember, and you may recall that when we analyzed ir, we said even though it doesn't have a feminine singular suffix, it is treated in the Hebrew Bible as a feminine noun, and therefore ir is feminine singular. And when we add the definite article, hey, but not patach, we get kamatz. Why do we add kamatz? Because that's a longer vowel, and we need a longer vowel to compensate for the fact that ayin does not take a dagesh. It cannot double. And so this is called compensatory lengthening. Ha'ir hagdolah. All right, and you may want to pause the recording now just to see if you can locate some of the other forms with the prefix by the definite article. And the top one is hayam, hayam. That has the hey, the patach, and the dagesh in the yud, just to the left there. You can see the dot. Beneath that, we have v'ha'oniyah. Now we've got the hey, but because it's followed by an aleph, and alephs don't double, there's no dagesh, and therefore the patach is lengthened into a kamatz, compensatory lengthening again. And then after that, we get the form ha-malachim, hey, patach, dagesh in the mem. That's the expected form. Well, congratulations. You are reading Hebrew now after such a short time, not only from a printed edition, but from the manuscript itself, the 11th century manuscript, the Leningrad Codex. All right, that does it for this video. In our next video, we'll continue our discussion of the definite article in Hebrew, so stay tuned. And if you have any questions or comments in the meantime, please be sure to share them on the Patreon channel. I look forward to hearing from you and to corresponding with you. All right, take care, everybody.